Thank you, Murray, and welcome to everybody to this conversation. I have to say I'm a little bit daunted by the topic that we've been given, how to reverse the doomsday clock to solve the world's problems in about 45, 50 minutes. Will be no problem, will it? But time is obviously of the essence, so we do need to get onto it. The aim this morning is to have a look at the extent to which the pandemic has been a wake-up call, and if it is a wake-up call for what? If we're going to turn back the doomsday clock, what do we need to do? What do we need to change? So to our problem solvers this morning, and I should note that their full bios are on the website, the Peace Leadership website, so I'm just going to give them a brief introduction. On my right here in Melbourne, the Professor, the Honourable Gareth Evans, who of course you will know well, 21 years in Australian Parliament, a Cabinet Minister and former Australian Foreign Minister. He's also led the Brussels-based International Crisis Group and for almost a decade was Chancellor of the ANU. Welcome, Gareth. Also with me in Melbourne, I've got Ian Risley, Chartered Accountant and Principal of Ian Risley & Co. Ian's honours include the AusAid Peace Builder Award from the Australian Government in recognition of his work in East Timor, and also the Medal of the Order of Australia for services to the Australian community. And welcome to you too. It is just lovely to have at least two people with me, if not everybody. So joining us from a little bit further afield from Phnom Penh in Cambodia is Emma Leslie. Emma's an Australian Cambodian who's worked on conflict, transformation and peace building throughout Asia. You may well have already met Emma. She's also presented in previous sessions. And since moving to Cambodia in 1997, she's supported a number of peace initiatives, the latest being the launch of the Cambodia Peace Museum. In 2008, she established the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, which she now leads. Emma, welcome. Good to see you have such an excellent internet connection from Cambodia.
Thanks, Ellie.
Let's see if we can say the same thing from Sydney, which is where we are joined by Steve Gillalay. Steve is a global philanthropist. He's focused on peace and sustainable development with a career in technology and international business development. Over the last 2 decades, he's applied his business skills to philanthropic activities. He's established the global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, and also a private family charity, the Charitable Foundation. Steve, lovely to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Excellent. Well, if you've read the 2021 Doomsday Clock statement, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists wrote that the pandemic served as a historic wake-up call, a vivid illustration that national governments and international organisations are unprepared to manage nuclear weapons and climate change or the other dangers that could threaten civilization in the near future. So to our first and very fundamental question to our panel, if it's a wake-up call to what? What do we need to change? Gareth?
Well, hopefully it will be a huge wake-up call as to the absolute necessity for a collaborative, cooperative, international, multilateral approach to the resolution of all the world's key economic, security and social problems as well. Certainly for the big 3 existential risks of pandemics, climate and nukes, but also to a whole bunch of global public goods problems that Kofi Annan used to call problems without passports. That no one country can solve by itself, whether it's terrorism or whether it's piracy or unregulated population movements or international crime or whatever. But also we need collaborative internationalism when it comes to solving conflict situations through a cooperative approach, as we did in Cambodia all those years ago. You can't just enforce solutions, you've got to work at them. So hopefully that will be what this is all about. But of course, the more pessimistic perception is that the pandemic is going to be a wake-up call in another direction, encouraging extreme nationalism, defensiveness, building barriers, walls, distrust of multilateral institutions, and generally the kind of inward-looking isolation, which is utterly at odds with our capacity to solve these big problems. I think the jury is out as to which view is going to prevail at the moment. I'm an optimist. I think the emphasis will be on collaborative, cooperative solutions. And one very early good sign of that, I think, is the fact that the United States and China have agreed on the cooperative approach to resolving climate. If that's going to be the way forward for the future, notwithstanding all the other tensions we can see, we will have something at least to thank the pandemic for.
And I will return to that and the whole issue of climate change. But Emma, if I can bring you in here, first I'd like to ask you whether you actually recognise the doomsday clock as such, and whether or not you do or you don't, what do you think we need to change to try and prevent some of these existential threats becoming reality?
Actually, It is a question about glass half full or glass half empty. And I guess it's always full and empty. And that's why, I mean, having this conversation in the midst of Rotary is important, because I think the wake-up call has been to the peoples of the world in this last year, as they've had to learn an extraordinary amount of resilience to be able to go through this process, but also to be able to reach out and start collaborating with each other. So as Gareth talked about institutions and states that need to start working together, I think it's also about how we partner with civil society, but also we've seen the rise of a whole lot of new people's movements. And so Myanmar at the moment is a classic example of that, is young people, young leaders stepping up and saying, you know what, you guys are all getting it wrong. We don't want this system. We don't want these kind of structures. They're connecting in with the Milk Tea Alliance and all of those kinds of things. So in a way, we want to engage those movements and bring them into the conversation, not have those two things set up against each other. So I hope that's the wake-up call we're hearing too.
At the same time, though, I guess that you see optimism in what's happening in Myanmar. There's also death, and people are dying for what they believe in, and they're dying in their hundreds.
Right. And actually, they have been for 70 years. And we could say the same thing about the Korean Peninsula, Cameroon, Syria, Yemen. And sometimes we only wake up when we see it flashing on our TVs at night, but we don't look deeper into the structural and systemic violence that's always there, the sorts of systems that exclude people, keep people out, racism, discrimination, but also constitutions, governments that don't actually represent all of their people. And so I think we need to look deeper into that, because there's always death. But what this generation is saying to us is we're willing to risk this physical violence as long as we never have to live under a military regime ever again, because they know that that's a systemic violence. And I think that's something, that a nuance that we haven't really come to terms with yet in our day-to-day understanding of situations around the world.
Steve, what are your thoughts? And we've had Gareth talk about very much the big picture, international cooperation, then Emma talk about cooperation at a more individual level. Where do you fit?
Well, I think I'll tackle it maybe from two different angles, and certainly working on the international system, getting better mechanisms for negotiations and such is a really good idea. But I'll hit the positives. So there's four things happening at the moment, I think, for nuclear disarmament, which are good. So we've got a lot on the US-China relationship. Australia's getting dragged into that. But there are three areas where the US and China are looking at cooperating. The first is climate change, which Gareth mentioned. The second is COVID-19 and sort of being able to address that. But the third is also nuclear. Now, if we go back to Iran, we had a nuclear deal with Iran. That was working well, and the last US administration undone it. The new administration's committed to trying to get that back on the table. And so is Iran. So you've actually got now them back at the table and working on it. Pakistan, India, another one of the friction points. If we look over the last month now, they're starting to engage in bilateral discussions, trying to ease the tensions between those two nations as well. And that obviously leads to Russia and the US. If we come back to Russia and the US, what we can see now over the last 60 years, they've built up really sophisticated protocols around how to react in case of scares around nuclear attacks. And I won't go into it now, but there have been a number of false positives where they've nearly actually gone to war. But the protocols they've got now in place, even with all the other tensions, mean that's probably okay. The second point I'd come back to is actually the Western democracies. And so from the work we do at the Institute for Economics and Peace, we can see many of the things which underpin stable Western democracies are on decline. I'd describe it not as catastrophic, but I'd describe it as something like a car with very, very squeaky wheels. And so I think we've got to spend time looking within our own systems to address a number of the issues there. We talk a lot more, but maybe that's the point to stop.
Steve, you raised lots of things, and I'm going to come back to all of them. But first of all, I do want to bring Ian in and ask for your thoughts on what we need to change.
Thanks, Ellie. Like Gareth, I'm a natural optimist, and I think it's been a wake-up call, but also a massive opportunity for the world at a macro and a micro level to emphasise international cooperation. When I was Rotary International President, I saw a lot of the world. The people you meet are, by and large, almost universally wonderful people. It tends to, where it gets to governments, that it tends to sort of fall flat a little bit. And I'm very optimistic about the world, about where we are. But there are challenges, and Gareth mentioned nuclear, which is outside my bailiwick, but certainly the environment, one area where Rotary is getting heavily involved. I think that's one of the challenges that we need to meet, and I'm really pleased that recent political changes have advanced the cause of the environment, and that's important.
I wasn't going to do this, but I think in the light of what Steve said, let's go to the nuclear issue now, because there was a really interesting speech that Gareth gave actually in 2019. And just for people who are listening who don't follow the nuclear debate on a regular basis, it's really worth just noting, as Gareth did, that there are 14,000 warheads still in existence. They have the combined destructive capability of 100,000 Hiroshimas. And also, again, as you noted in your speech, extraordinarily 2,000 US and Russian weapons remain on high alert. They can be launched by prime ministers with a 4 to 8 minute decision window. So, Gareth, I know that this issue concerns you dreadfully. I don't know whether less now that Donald Trump is not in charge, whether that makes it slightly better. But are you as optimistic as Steve is on the nuclear front?
I'm afraid on the nuclear front, I'm not. Steve's right that we've got some signs that North Korea and Iran negotiations are going to get back on track now that we've got past the lunacy of the Trump era. He's also right to emphasise the importance, as I think he did, of the nuclear ban treaty that has been agreed to by something like 130 of the world's countries. But the difficulty is all the nuclear armed states, and there are 9 of them at the moment, possessing 7,000 plus 13,000 weapons between them, 14,000 weapons. The nuclear armed states are showing no signs whatsoever of moving in the direction of disarmament. The arms control agreements we're all familiar with are either dead, dying, or on life support. Nuclear arsenals are being modernised. Nuclear weapons numbers are actually increasing, not least with the United Kingdom now coming, God help us, back into that game, which we all thought was long past so far as London was concerned. And what's even worse, we've got increasing talk about the utility of nuclear deterrence and the salience of nuclear weapons, and perhaps the need to go down the path of acquiring small-scale tactical nuclear weapons. All of this is just nuts because, as Steve, I think, also intimated, we know very well from the experience of the Cold War that maybe, whatever the risks of deliberate aggressive use of nuclear weapons may be, which I think is not a high risk, there's a huge risk of inadvertent use through system error, human idiocy, miscalculation, multiplied by the new phenomena of cyber sabotage and God knows what else. I think we're in a very, very dangerous place at the moment. And what we have to do is harness all the power of emotion, the horror, the indiscriminate inhumanity of nuclear weapons. We have to harness the power of reason, multiply the arguments out there in policymakers' minds about the strategic inutility, the uselessness ultimately of nuclear weapons. But we also have to be pragmatic and realistic and aim at a step-by-step approach of nuclear risk reduction rather than hoping that we'll get to global zero in 5 years or 10 years or tomorrow, which is what civil society activists tend to sort of dream about. There's a bit of a gap between the dream and the reality, but we have to put all our endeavours to make this particular part of the Doomsday Clock scenario not work out, because the Doomsday Clock is now, within 2 minutes?
Seconds.
Seconds.
100 seconds.
100 seconds, yes, less than 2 minutes away from midnight, the closest it's been since the height of the Cold War. And that reflects the reality that the risks are very, very high. And this is one of the 3 big existential risks to life on this planet as we know it. Hell of a lot of other things to worry about. We're going to be talking about some of them. But these are things that go to our very human existence. And we've got to do a hell of a lot better than we're doing at the moment.
Emma, can I ask you, it's a really depressing picture that Gareth paints, but obviously it's not something that you can just put to one side and say, well, we're not going to worry about that. Is this something that should come from bottom up, from people, as you say, harness the emotion? Top down hasn't been particularly successful.
Well, I actually don't know that I believe in bottom up and top down anymore anyway. I think we're operating in a system now that's much more linear, and actually I think it's much more about partnership. But I also want to add on to what Gareth said, which is I think this is about a significant investment in things like mediation, preventive diplomacy, facilitation, we need to be educating our young people about all of these issues that we're speaking about. And I don't see that in an Australian education system, let alone a global one. I want us to be teaching critical thinking skills, us to be questioning, how did we get to this moment? Because I think without a new generation, but also without leadership, without leaders who are questioning and raising these and bringing them into dialogue, then they're weapons, but it's the emotions and the narratives and the histories of violence and conflict that actually bring people to the moment of pressing that button. And I think Korean Peninsula is an absolutely classic example of that. It's 70 years of a Korean War. In Australia, we march down the street and have Anzac parades applauding veterans of that war, thinking it's over, but actually it's very real today for North and South Koreans. So that's about actual dialogue and preventive diplomacy. That's not necessarily about them holding weapons, although disarmament is fundamental.
Steve, can you see how, and all the things that Emma calls for make absolute sense, but in some of them we're doing, some of them we're not, but how do we make this the imperative that it has to be?
I think it's really, really difficult. So we come at it looking from a systems theory perspective. And so if you're looking at it and you're looking at the international system, you need a top-down approach really to be able to develop it. But on the other hand, you can't actually have a top-down approach unless each of the nations in the world themselves are functioning. I honestly don't see any likelihood of Russia, US, China, and a number of the others giving up their nuclear weapons. Some of them could, but there's major powers I can't see doing it. So therefore, I'm back to where I think we need is to have a lot better sense of the negotiations around sort of the use and deployment of these weapons and being able to get better international relations, because countries are going to compete. The US and China are competing economically at the moment, and it's likely to spill over into areas of military conflict at some point in the future. So I think the areas of international negotiation are absolutely strategic.
I think Steve and Emma are both right in the sense that bottom-up pressure and all the education and knowledge and understanding of the issues that goes with effective bottom-up pressure is absolutely crucial in concentrating the minds of political leaders. They won't respond in the abstract, they will respond to the sense that there's something pushing them. Steve's also right about top-down. Unless the total senior decision makers understand the issues that are involved here and start getting serious about moving down the Salmon path, we're not going to get anywhere. I'm a little bit more hopeful than he is about China's possible cooperative role in this respect. China at least has always been a minimal nuclear deterrence power, sitting on about 300 weapons as compared with 6,500, 7,000, which is the case for Russia and the United States. It has genuinely agreed to, signed up to the doctrine of no first use, indicating that it's only ever going to use them in a retaliatory way. And I think even though the dynamics are changing, it is possible to harness a little bit of sense in China in particular in that area. But it's, as well as, the final point I want to make is, as well as top down and bottom up, there's also peer group pressure. It's very, very important in all forms of negotiation, all forms of policy making. The peer group that's relevant here are those wider community of states in the international community. And one very important subset of them, US allies and partners, including Australia. If we got together and actually made it very clear to the United States that we, the nuclear umbrella seekers of the United States protection, do strongly believe in a move towards disarmament and nuclear risk reduction, and in particular the adoption by the US, as Obama wanted to do, of a no first use doctrine, then that would be very important. What happened last time round with Obama is that Japan, Korea, Australia, the NATO allies all said, no, 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 that's dangerous. We want the full flourish of every possible dimension of the nuclear deterrent. The middle powers, the smaller guys in the system, have just as much clout and significance in the scheme of things as in many ways do the big guys and the people that are pushing from below. We've got to press all those buttons if we're going to solve some of these big security problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ellie, let me ask Gareth, if you were the leader of North Korea, Israel, Iran, why would you give up your nuclear capability, which many people would see as the only thing that's keeping you from annihilation?
Because if you're Kim Jong-un in Korea, and he's not insane despite some claims to that effect, you understand that any use of nuclear weapons to be homicidal would be to be suicidal. any even serious threat of imminent use of them would turn North Korea into a car park as a result of the conventional firepower of the United States alone, not least with Japan and everyone else attached to it as well. He is about regime survival, and he is willing to negotiate that. We haven't been very good at negotiating reciprocally in return, as Emma knows from the work that her organisation has done. We've had our chances in the past. I was involved in some of those negotiations. We haven't met our own obligations to move quicker down the path of diplomatic reconciliation and so on, and providing alternative energy sources for them. I'm maybe a naive optimist, but I don't believe the situation in North Korea is irredeemable, irreducible at all. The circus diplomacy of Donald Trump wasn't very helpful, but at least he was right in engaging and wanting to engage directly with the leadership. And I think that's a lesson the Biden administration's got to learn, but approach it in a step-by-step confidence-building, trust-building way. We're not going to get there quickly, but we can get there.
I know a lot of the things that we talked about in relation to the nuclear threat also apply to the other great existential threat of climate change. But I just wanted to pick up a couple of points that Gareth mentioned at the outset. Of course, you now have this China-US commitment, very non-specific, but at least it's a commitment to work together to mitigate climate change. But Steve, you made the point that relations are not great between the US and China. I think you even said that, that there's a possibility of that leading to a confrontation. So how do you read the commitment by the two countries to work on climate change, and how do you read the ability of these major powers to work together in areas of global significance where they can put aside their differences and get on with it?
So I think for me, I'm probably a little bit more optimistic on climate change than most people, because I think in the end, technology is going to drive us there through innovation, and that clean energy is just going to become a much more cheaper, much more viable option than let's say coal-fired energy or gas or oil. So if we're looking at China, for example, now admittedly it's starting coal-fired power stations at the rate of almost one a day, but we look at it, they're also the largest supplier of the solar panels in the world, and they've got a huge industry in that. We're finding now, getting it down to the individual level, that solar power is a cheaper form of electricity than what you'll get out of coal-fired power stations or buying it off the grid. We're even seeing new innovative techniques coming up, like one of the ones just out of Victoria, which was a world first, I was looking at last week. Victorian Bitter now have done a deal with one of the energy companies there to buy solar, which people put in off the grid. And what they'll do is for every $30 worth of the solar they'll purchase from the energy company, which comes in from the grid, they'll give the customers $50 worth of beer. And so there's these techniques for just actually really increasing the underlying demand and people's commitment to going solar. Similarly, as with battery technology, as that comes along, we'll be getting better and better at doing it. So we've got things like Boyle's Law, which are associated with computing, where the cost of computers are halving every year. You're seeing the same kind of technological advances in terms of solar these days and battery storage. So from this angle, I'm pretty confident. But what I would say, climate change, before we get there, we've still got a good 30 years to go. And what worries me, and we've done quite a bit of research on this in the Institute for Economics and Peace, it's the conflict-related aspects which we can see with climate change. But they're also combined with other things, food shortage, large increases in populations in probably the poorest and also the most conflict-ridden countries as well. So they're the kind of things which sort of come back, and it's the conflict side of it which really concerns me. I think there's enough international will. In the long run, we'll get there.
At the same time, and let me throw this one to you, you only have to look at the current Australian government to see where self-interest can skew government behaviour. So it sort of seems, on the one hand, we're talking about the global powers working together for this existential crisis, and then we look at a very domestic, local level where we can't get it together for the love of money.
But this is where I think it differs from nuclear, in that it is bottoms up. Things have changed enormously, and it is now almost fashionable to believe in the environment. Gone are the days when you could march into Parliament saying this is coal, it won't hurt you. Well, now there's a magical change that as soon as the electorate moves, suddenly politicians move. And I'm with Steve. I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, particularly with the economic aspects. The fact that as batteries become more and more efficient, effective, and what's more affordable, I think the vast majority of houses will have something on their roofs. A lot of them do now, but of course the feed-in tariff is a bit of an issue. But if you can store your own, it will, let's face it, the days of any new coal-powered stations are gone. They're just not going to happen anymore.
Gareth, are you optimistic?
Yeah, what should make us optimistic that China will actually deliver on what it's saying is not just the technological imperatives that are driving the total system, as Steve and Ian have described, it's the political imperative that China feels from the pressure of its own population that is really, really deeply unhappy about the pollution they daily experience and putting huge pressure bottom up on the Chinese government to get its act together. I think there's a storyline there for us in Australia. We have to mobilise community pressure and just get that political environment to give such an unequivocal message to the present government that it can no longer bugger about to the extent that it's manifestly still intending to do.
Emma, what about your perspective, particularly given where you sit in the region?
I think, this whole conversation shows you how interconnected these things are. So climate conflict, nuclear weapons, and without wanting to circle too much back to North Korea. I mean, North Korea is a country with only 30% arable land that they can actually grow food. So not only are they isolated, not only do we not pay attention to them and think that they're crazy, but also they just can't, in this climate situation, grow their own food. So we actually have to invest a whole lot more, not only in that preventive diplomacy mediation part, but also in aid, in being more generous about bringing in refugees. We need to be a much better global citizen as Australians if we really are serious about deterrence of nuclear weapons, because people have them because they don't feel like they're being heard. People go into conflict because they actually don't feel like anybody cares about what their exclusion or what's happening to them inside their context. So we have Tamil refugees because Sri Lanka is a country that still persecutes Tamils. We need to be much more considered in our domestic policy as it impacts on the rest of the world. So we can't touch one without the other. And I think the point about China, US, and Russia is absolute, but equally none of those administrations are monolithic. And what we have to do is find our ways into them. That's why organisations like institutions like the University of Melbourne are so critical, because they have the chance to partner with Chinese universities. Chinese universities influence Chinese policy. So there's a ton of opportunities, but we need to really step in, lean in, practice the values of dialogue, but equally generosity. And I think that's an Australian value, but one that I think that we've sometimes dumbed down and dulled. And I think it's time for us to step up.
Right. Can I pick up on what Emma's just been saying about good international citizenship? There's a bit of a disposition, certainly in the current government, to think that this sort of aid stuff and other forms of contribution to other people's humanity and achieving decency elsewhere is really just Boy Scout good deeds. It's good if you've got the resources available to do it, but it's not really part of the inherent business or responsibilities of government. I've long argued that being seen to be a good international citizen is a category of real hard-headed national interest in its own right, which sits right up there alongside the traditional duo of economic interests and security protection interests. Our interest in being seen to be a good international citizen is that not only is that the right thing to do morally because of the nature of these problems, the nature of our common humanity, but it also generates quite hard-headed returns for us. It generates reciprocity. My support for you on this issue will be that much better guaranteed to win your support on some other issue from them, even though it's not in their particular personal interest to do so. And it's reputational. A country that has a reputation for decency, for being willing to collaboratively work to address these problems without passports, on everything across the range from arms control to pandemics, to climate, to terrorism, to organised crime, to women's trafficking, to slavery. A country with a reputation for decency and not always just looking to the bottom line dollar or the bottom line border protection security is a country that genuinely benefits from that. My favourite example is squeaky clean Sweden, Scandinavia, Sweden in particular. Huge reputation for decency, won properly over many, many years of commitment to aid and everything else. Also happens to be one of the biggest arms suppliers in the world, because people are totally confident and happy about dealing with a country with those sort of cultural credentials. So, I mean, that's the hard-headed, that's the pragmatic reason for being a good international citizen. But there's also, of course, a very strong moral reason. And I hope that Rotary and everyone else that's in the business of generating a decency of response in us will keep working away at these issues.
Steve, do you think our international reputation as a decent global citizen is strong? Or do you think there is a real risk that it's being undermined by things like cutting back on our aid and by positions that we take on particular global relationships?
Look, I think Australia's international reputation is very, very strong. But I agree with the sentiments. But if we look, there's a broader thrust than Australia. This conversation so far is very much Australian. If we move further on field, we find that overseas developmental aid's generally getting cut right around the world. IFID's in the process, and it has been for the last 18 months, of streaming out all its overseas aid. US is cut back there. It may pick up again under Biden's administration. But given the economic crisis coming out of the back of COVID and really poor government budgets, I don't see anything about overseas developmental aids bouncing back. Certainly the soft power aspect's very, very real. Australia really needs to focus specifically on the Pacific Islands, because climate change to them, they see it's a very, very real threat. But sort of from the work we do, the areas which sort of worry me out of all this is 3 different areas in the world. The first is the Sahel, Horn of Africa in Northern Africa. The second, Southern Africa, stretching from Angola through to Madagascar. The final one's the Middle East to Central Asia, running from Syria to Pakistan. We look at this there, we've got 19 countries with the severest threat. They're home to about 2.1 billion people, and over half of them are amongst the least peaceful countries in the world. If we go back and we look at sort of things like, let's say, the Global Terrorism Index, which we produced, 7 of the 10 countries with the largest increases in terrorism were all in that Sahel, Horn of Africa area. And also, those countries have got some of the highest, or are amongst the 17 countries with the highest birth rates in the world. We look at food availability and we go back, so it's a virtuous cycle running up to about 2014. We were feeding more and more people on the planet, and undernutrition was dropping. But since 2014, it's been on the increase. It's gone from 23% up to 26%. We're expecting in the next 30 years the need for food to increase by 50%. Mainly followed by the rising middle class in China. So these are the things I think we've got to address. Overseas developmental aid will help, but it won't be enough.
I was going to say, how do you address it? Really, the problem is well recognised.
Right. Okay, so if it was me, okay, there's a whole range of things. One is we do need developmental aid. We need to start looking on longer time periods going forward. Quite often when we're looking at international crises, we look at it as it's occurring and try and intervene then. We need to be looking at 10-year timeframes. We really need to be able to tackle the countries with the highest birth control. We need to really be able to get at that. And we need to be able to work out how do you monetize water, particularly in the area of food, so you can create micro businesses in these areas, which will then start to...
Look, we need all those things, but we also need the rich countries to be generous to meet our responsibilities. Australia at the moment is conspicuously not being. Our aid is a proportion.
Gareth, I agree with you.
Down
Gareth,
0.2%, as distinct from the world target of 0.7%. We are as low as we have ever been, and that just is no excuse. I mean, people talk about the debts we've incurred as a result of COVID, pandemic and everything else, but our debt to GDP ratio is still perfectly comfortable by world standards. We have the resources and we should be prepared to spend them. And this present government's lack of generosity is something that I think really ought to generate a lot more concern from the wider community, which has shown...
Gareth, I agree with you. We should be spending more, but it wouldn't matter how much we were spending. It's not going to be enough. We need new, more creative thinking.
We are almost time, and I just have to get on with we have 4 people on the panel. Emma, let me ask you, what's your perspective on that? How countries position themselves from an aid perspective and being good global citizens, and how, for example, how Australia is viewed in the region?
I mean, I think Australia's leaning pretty heavily on its past, and I think that Australia has been a good partner in the past, but I do think that we're on a severe risk of becoming still that white nation in the midst of Asia, and I think we really, really have to evaluate that. And I think our China-Australia relationship really needs serious attention, but equally we need to increase aid. But I do want to just shift this conversation a little bit back to, I think it's really time that we listened a lot harder to what young people are saying to us. And I said earlier that it's time for us to bring the movements of young people to us, but I actually think it's time for us to listen more deeply to young people, because I think they understand this way better than any of us. And here we all are, older people with grey hair, debating this. But really, the Malalas and the Gretas and the Joshua Wongs have been saying some pretty harsh but in the face courageous kinds of things. And I think that manifests in aid and mediation and all the rest, but it's also time for us to change our fundamental way of power. And I think listening to young people changes that, but I also think much more feminist approaches, and I don't mean women's leadership per se, I mean feminist in the sense of sharing power. The more power we give away, the more power there is. The more security we give away, the more generous we are, the more secure we are. And I think that's a fundamental paradigm that we're looking at here. It's not just more aid, it's not just more of this or that. It's an actual fundamental systems change. And I think that's what we need in Australia desperately. I think that's what our Indigenous people say to us. I think that's what women are saying. That's what the debate recently has been about. It's not about men versus women. It's about actually a patriarchal, hierarchical system to a system that hears the voices of young people, that shares and collaborates around power. And I think that's where we need to be headed.
Yeah, can I ask you about that?
100% agree with Emma, and while she wasn't prepared to say it, I will. I think the world is a better, safer place when we have more women as leaders. I'll be right up front about that. And if you look at the countries that do have women as leaders, they tend to be more rational and more forward-thinking, etc. And the rest of the world just needs to look at that. They need to say we need to have a calmer approach, and it's not feminist, it's just rational. And I think we need that, and it's demonstrated by the women leaders we see in the world. 100% agree with you, Emma.
I've got a question which I want to put to each of the panel for the end, but just before I do that, I do want to put the issue you raised just then, the Australia-China relationship. And with my news hat on, I know a lot of people who are watching today would have read the headlines this morning and will be keen for a perspective, no doubt, on the federal government's decision to tear up Victoria's agreements on the Belt and Road with China, memorandums of understanding. It's the first time the Commonwealth has ever used a piece of legislation, in fact, new legislation, to override a state. And it comes, as everyone knows, at a time where our relations are at the lowest ebb ever. Your thoughts?
Well, this is a conspicuous overreaction, a completely unnecessary one, not least because of the current lamentable state of the overall relationship. A lot of which has to do, of course, with things that China has been doing wrong and aggressively and offensively and do demand pushback. But we have been constantly overstrident, overzealous in our own response. We've been incautious in the language we've used. We've been incautious in setting in train what's been seen by China as really hurtful to its own interests, enterprises in accountability for COVID and so on, which were perfectly sensible in the abstract, but which were ill-prepared operationally, diplomatically, and were simply counterproductive. We've got a relationship which we have to simultaneously, the famous Scottish Labour Party guy, Jimmy Maxton, said back in the 1930s, if you can't ride 2 bloody horses at once, you shouldn't be in the bloody circus. And the truth of the matter is we do have an incredibly dependent economic relationship with China. We're not going to be able to diversify nearly 40% of our exports anytime soon. We do have a relationship that has to be kept alive on that particular front, but at the same time, consistent with our own dignity, our own democracy, our own principles, we do have to push back where there's egregious human rights violations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, where there's overreach territorially in the South China Sea and elsewhere. We can do that, but it requires sophisticated diplomacy, sophisticated politics, not the instant coffee Wolverine sort of reactions we're getting currently from the present government. I despair.
The former ambassador to Beijing, Australia's former ambassador Jeff Raby, who's just recently written a book, has a lovely line where we have to decide whether, we have to find that midway between sycophancy and hostility, and we don't seem particularly good at doing it. But from the regional point of view, Emma, I mean, China is absolutely, it's essential to every conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question. And I think this is something that Australia needs to come to terms with. Is 20 years ago, China wasn't out. It wasn't expansionist. It wasn't in the world. And there was a moment when the Communist Party decided that its state-owned enterprises could go out into the world. Now, they've learned a lot from that very quickly. I remember listening to somebody in the National Development Bank in Beijing say that when they got to Africa, they were a bit shocked. Where was the infrastructure after all those hundreds of years of colonialism? Why were there not roads and railways and so on? And of course, they were perceived as being extractive and taking all of the oil and everything else. Of course that was happening. But at the same time, they were deeply concerned about why people don't have spaces, buildings, connectivity. So I think we really, really have to reach that level of sophistication that Gareth mentioned, where we have to be able to see the black and white and the grey. And we have to be able to operate in that grey area where we can actually say hard things to each other. That's a mature relationship. But at the same time, understand that we're interconnected. Our world is not what it was 30 years ago, Cold War diplomacy, blah, blah, blah. We're now in such an interconnectivity that we can't just block each other out. It won't work. And it doesn't work for economies. It won't work for human relationships either.
When you look at winding back the Doomsday Clock, which is where we started this conversation, and you look at the need for greater international collaboration and cooperation at an individual level, at a systems level, at a government level, how important or how relevant and fit for purpose are the institutions that we have today? Emma, you said to me on the phone a wonderful thing that was, if we didn't have the UN today, we'd probably create it. I mean, how relevant do you think that the institutions that are so important for this global cooperation, are they fit for purpose in 2021?
I mean, nobody's fit for purpose. I think we all can step it up. I think the United Nations obviously needs ongoing reform in order to keep pace, but obviously it also needs a massive injection of funds. It operates on such a low budget, and I think this came up in the conversation we had yesterday in the conference, is, I mean, what the UN does and its personnel tries to achieve on such limited funding is really remarkable. But I also want to say that a club of states no longer serves purpose in terms of what we need to get done in the world. And so that's why you do see the movements for the abolition of nuclear weapons. You do see the campaigns to ban landmines. You do see alliances and people coming together because they're frustrated that UN top-down, the people of Myanmar right now, please, responsibility to protect, come save us, when most of us know pragmatically that the Security Council is not sending anybody to save them as such. And so then they turn to other movements, civil disobedience, milk tea alliances, and so on. So I think, yes, multilateral institutions we need, and as I said, we would invent them today. Governments would want to come together. We need that space for dialogue, but we also need to find other places. And I think Rotary is a classic example. Rotary can actually have extraordinary influence in the world in the way that it functions, in its volunteerism and its values. It's fit for purpose, I would have to say. And I think, yeah, it could also step up. But the UN, for sure, we need reform, but it's doing it pretty hard.
Gareth, the responsibility to protect is very close to your heart. How do you see it in the context of a country like Myanmar at the moment?
Well, responsibility to protect was a huge normative step forward, which only happened because the United Nations General Assembly, meeting at heads of state and government level in 2005, unanimously endorsed the proposition that mass atrocity crimes were everybody's business, not nobody's. And the traditional arguments about domestic jurisdiction just didn't wash. That was a watershed moment, and that was driven by the United Nations. Yes, the Security Council has been a bust in terms of its capacity to actually deliver strong responses, not just military responses, but a lot of other stuff as well, arms embargoes and sanctions and reference to the International Criminal Court for criminal prosecution of the generals who are obviously committing crimes against humanity. Yes, the Security Council has been a bust because we're stuck with this structure of the mid-20th century rather than the 21st, and we're stuck with these veto powers. So you've got to work around it in all sorts of other ways. But there's other regional organisations that are doing very well, particularly in Africa, West Africa, not so great in Asia, I'm afraid, with ASEAN, but we'll see on the weekend whether there's any difference there. But there's a whole array of strategies, the responsibility to protect, which don't just depend on the Security Council. They depend on every player in the international community and individuals as well as states. And if we take seriously that responsibility to protect, we'd be putting a hell of a lot more pressure on the Myanmar generals now than we have been. I think at the end of the day, picking up Emma's earlier point about the young people's voices being heard, at the end of the day, I think the dynamic that is really going to make the ultimate difference in Myanmar is that internal dynamic where you've got an absolute unity right across the country now. Those young voices and young lives are absolutely unwilling to be stood over any longer. And I think the generals are going to appreciate eventually the ungovernability of the country and start looking for exit routes, off-ramps that will be hopefully a way of avoiding a further cataclysm. So yes, there's institutional problems everywhere you look, but don't ever underestimate the utility of organisations like the World Health Organization, UNHCR, the Human Rights Council, the WTO. These are all critical parts of the international community. And to go down the sort of route of the Trump administration or some earlier Australian government administrations of dismissing the utility of those multilateral organisations and institutions is a recipe, I think, for just going very, very sadly backwards. But you're all right about the necessity to mobilise civil society, the role of organisations like Rotary in doing just that. All of these things play critically into the game. And NGOs like Steve's, I think, has also been tremendously important and influential in building databases and engaging in advocacy, including on a lot of issues which are a long way away from people's immediate focus of attention. But NGOs, civil society, individuals in the community all have roles to play in making the world a bit safer and saner than it is at the moment.
At my peril, I'm going to, with just a minute and a half, 2 minutes to go, put a final question to each of our panel. So I am begging you, please, try and solve the world's problems for me in about 30 seconds. Optimist or pessimist? If I ask you to look 20 to 30 years down the track, are we going to be living in a nuclear wasteland with the climate destroyed and the doomsday clock blown to smithereens? Or is it going to be a better world? Steve?
I think it'll vary. Some things will improve. I think per capita income is going to improve over that time. Life expectancy is going to improve. We're going to get a lot better at increasing areas of well-being for many people in the world. However, on the other hand, I think climate change over the next 30 years will get worse. I think there'll be the political the situation around nukes won't change too much. But by that time, we'll have other threats rising, which we need to go to address. And that really comes back to sort of the international systems. They need to be more inclusive. The UN, working with it, I can tell you now, is incredibly inefficient. One of the most inefficient things I know, but we need it. We absolutely need it. So by evolving the function of the UN so that we get more groups in, like business, how do you get business there? How do you get civil society there? How do you get other groups, educators, represented within these global governance bodies, just not states and politicians? I think is incredibly important. So for me, that's the direction I'd take the evolution.
Emma, optimist or pessimist?
I mean, absolute optimist, because there's no doubt that humanity has an extraordinary resilience to work through these things. And we've only spent a year in a global pandemic and we're already getting vaccines. And to honour those that have died through that process, but also to be aware of how we're coming out of it strongly. And I think, to end with young people, I have full faith in my nephews in Australia and my kids here in Cambodia that, we can actually trust them to lead us forward, and we need to follow and listen.
Ian?
Optimist, absolutely, Ali, for a series of reasons, but let me highlight two. Organisations like Steve Killilay's philanthropy around the world makes a huge difference, and we're grateful to all of them, including the Institute for Economics and Peace, Steve. And secondly, to pick up what Emma has said again, young people, the future of the world is obviously people younger than the grey hairs at this end. No disrespect, Ali. Yeah, I was gesturing to Gareth. But and that's why Rotary does so much work with younger people in terms of all of our programs. A lot of them relate to young people because they are the future, not of Australia, but of the entire planet. And all those that I see, I'm really impressed with.
I'm an optimist essentially for two reasons, even though I'm obviously anxious about what could go wrong with nukes and God knows what else. I'm an optimist, A, because I think the world has learned something over the last century about the absolute lunacy of resorting to violence as a way of advancing national interests or policy objectives. The costs versus the risks and the returns are just absolutely gigantic, not least with modern technologies. And that's, I think, the reason more than anything else why we have managed so far to avoid total global conflagrations, even though so many pressures and tensions have been pushing in that direction. I think there's a fair chance that sanity will prevail, that the culture is changing, the global psychology is gradually changing. Lots of backsliding in all sorts of ways we can identify, but I think that's the trend. The other reason I'm an optimist is because we have to be. Because you do not get anything done to make the world safer and saner unless you believe in the possibility of that happening. Yeah. Optimism is self-reinforcing in exactly the same way that pessimism is self-defeating. The future has to depend on people, enough people, staying optimistic about the possibility of making the world a decent place.
What a perfect note to end our conversation on, with great optimism from all of us. So from me, a big thank you to our panel, and I'd just like to invite Murray back to officially close the session.
Thank you very much, Ali. What a wonderful session we've just had. Pardon my back, pal.
It's your best look, Murray.
Could we please have a virtual round of applause for our panel, please? I love the final line, believe in the possibilities. Listening to that conversation, I was at times quite depressed and other times quite elated. So have you ended up an optimist or a pessimist after listening to that conversation? I love to talk about the need for Australia to be a good international citizen, to be generous with our aid, and also to develop women and young people as leaders. I thought that was a really important point, and I related to that very well. So thank you to Ian and Gareth for being here with us today, and for Emma and Steve for coming online and being part of such a fabulous discussion. And special thanks to Ali for leading that discussion so well. It really was worth it. I've been asked to just mention a few take-home points from the 2 days that we've been through, 6.5 hours discussing peace-related matters. So the Future of Peace Leadership Symposium started yesterday with a powerful address by Tilman Ruff, asking the question, how can we eliminate nuclear weapons before they end us? Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow emphasised that we must not tolerate this insanity anymore. And in the discussion that followed, Tilman pointed out that Rotary could have a crucial advocacy role in ending the nuclear weapon age. Preventing nuclear war is an historic obligation, like ending climate change. Emma Leslie, in her fascinating address, gave us 6 qualities that we needed for peace building. The courage to try new things, building connections and collaborations, being creative to try and do things differently, be uncompromising in our commitment to peace and to achieve conflict transformation. Natasha, when she spoke about her outstanding work in the Horn of Africa, really did emphasise some of those points as well. She also talked about Rotary's global presence. It is real and effective, and that Rotary teaches the rest of the world about genuine connectivity. Jose Ramos Horta also, as he talked about his journey to peace, spoke about the importance of collaboration and connectivity. Tilman Ruff at one stage mentioned that we should always be on the lookout to try something new. If it works, do it again. If it doesn't, try something new. And in a similar vein, Ravi Ravindran, in his powerful presentation on Rotary and Peace, said, we as peacemakers must build peace because it is the right thing to do. It may not come easily, but we must strive for it. So let's continue to connect and collaborate to build peace at home and abroad. I thank you all for being with us today and for being involved with the discussion. I'd like to particularly thank our panel today, our keynote speakers, Tilman Ruff, Emma Leslie, Jose Ramos-Horta and Natasha Ritskoff. Also like to thank my co-hosts, Tanya and Jess, for doing such a wonderful job, and all the session leaders and presenters. I hope you will continue the discussions we've had today when you go back to your own Rotary clubs and your own groups and so forth, and with your families and your own network. So thank you all for joining us.
I'm interrupting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Look, I have to give the last word to the past Rotary International President, Ian Risley.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Very good. I'd like, on behalf of all of Rotary, to thank the people who put this together. A wonderful concept and a lot of work involved, I know. And I know, first of all, we have a great example here in Tanya of what it is that Rotary does in regard to peace. One of our first peace scholars 20 years ago, and she must have been about 3 at the time. and as a result of, she's a prime example of the work that Rotary does in peace and the net result of it. It's wonderful to have you here. And I know, Professor John, you're working on the Melbourne University peace aspect, and it's wonderful to see peace expanding. I know also, Murray, that Rob Helm started this planning, and then you've brought it to fruition. So I congratulate both of you on the initiative and the end result. So bravo.
Thanks very much.